everyone, welcome to the Medico Champs. This video is about the spinal nerve formation. In this video, we're gonna mainly focus on the anatomy of the spinal nerves, so let's get started. First of all, the spinal nerves are mixed nerves, so they contain both the motor and sensory fibers. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and it's very important to keep them in mind. There are 8 pairs from cervical, 12 from thoracic, 5 from lumbar, 5 from sacral, and only 1 pair of spinal nerves arise from the coccygean region of the spinal cord. So the formation of spinal nerves. The spinal nerve is a mixed nerve having both sensory and motor fibers. The spinal nerve is connected with the spinal cord by ventral and dorsal nerve roots. The dorsal root is recognized by the presence of a spinal ganglion. It is a localized swelling consisting of the cell bodies of pseudounipolar neurons. We know that most of the pseudounipolar neurons in our body are actually sensory neurons. So the dorsal nerve root actually supplies the sensory fibers. Here's a pseudounipolar neuron. In a pseudounipolar neuron, there is only one single projection from the cell body, which is known as the neurite. This neurite then further divides into central and peripheral processes. The central process acts like axon to carry the impulse to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, while the peripheral process acts as dendrite, and it carries the message towards the spinal cord from the sensory receptors. The ventral root are actually the axons of multipolar neurons, as we know that the multipolar neurons are mostly the motor neurons. Hence, the ventral root of the spinal cord mostly supplies the motor fibers to the spinal nerve. Both the dorsal nerve root and the ventral nerve root then combines to form the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve contains both the sensory and motor fibers, and it also contains the sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers, which come from the ventral root of the spinal nerve. Then this spinal nerve further divides into dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus. We'll discuss about these ramus later, and the sympathetic ganglia is of prime importance in the anatomy of the spinal nerves. We'll see what it is. First of all, we must keep that in mind that the spinal nerve contains both sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers. The sympathetic fibers are responsible for the fight and flight response. Thus, it helps to maintain the body in stress situations, while the parasympathetic fibers, they help in non-stress situations and keep the body in a normal pace so that it can function properly under normal conditions. We can say that the sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers create a homeostasis in the body. Parasympathetic mainly normalizing the functions, and sympathetic mainly combat the outside changes or threats. So, here comes the interesting part. The sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers are not supplied to all the spinal nerves leaving the spinal cord. Instead, these fibers are supplied to T1, from T1 to L2 spinal nerves. Only these spinal nerves have sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers. The most important part, on both lateral sides of the vertebral column, there are sympathetic chains. These chains are actually chains of ganglia, which means collection of cell bodies, of course. So these are the cell bodies which are present on both of the lateral sides of the vertebral column. So how these are formed? Let's see. This is the dorsal root. Here it is the dorsal root ganglia, and this is the ventral root of the spinal nerve. And here they combine and form the spinal nerve. We know that the sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers are coming from the ventral root of the spinal nerve. These sympathetic fibers are going to supply these sympathetic chains. So they're going to enter these sympathetic ganglia. The sympathetic fibers before this ganglia are therefore known as the preganglionic sympathetic fibers. The preganglionic sympathetic fibers of the spinal nerve, they enter into these sympathetic chains. Here we see These are the sympathetic, preganglionic sympathetic fibers, and they are entering into the cell bodies of the sympathetic chains. These enter into these ganglia through the white ramus communicans. It's called white because the axons of the preganglionic sympathetic fibers are always myelinating. Inside the ganglia, synapses is formed between the axons and the cell bodies of these ganglia. Then the cytoplasmic projection of this cell body re-enters the spinal nerve through the gray ramus communicant. It's called gray because this one is non-myelinated. These axons are always non-myelinated. And what are we going to call these axons? Of course, the postganglionic sympathetic fibers. So here's the preganglionic sympathetic fibers which enter the ganglia through white ramus communicants. And these are the postganglionic sympathetic fibers entering into the spinal nerve through the gray ramus communicant. So this is how the sympathetic chains are formed. Now, the spinal nerve is formed and it has its sympathetic fibers. This then divides into the dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus. So a single spinal nerve supplies both the dorsal and the ventral parts of the body. The dorsal ramus supplying the posterior parts of the body and the ventral ramus supplying the anterior parts of the body. There is an important thing to remember about the ventral ramus. The ventral rami of the thoracic nerves mainly have their segmental distribution. Well, actually, the point is, each spinal nerve supplies in a very specific manner and on a very segmental and specific region, even on the skin. So there are specific regions of skin. The whole body is divided into specific regions supplied by specific spinal nerves, and it is mainly called as a dermatome. So this thoracic spinal nerve have high degree of segmental distribution on the body. It will be like this. One segment here on the thoracic side of the body. This is the thoracic side, if you consider it the thoracic side of the body. One segment supplied by T1, another by T2, this by T3, T4. In this way, specific segments are formed, supplied by very specific spinal nerves. However, other spinal nerves, such as the cervical spinal nerves, brachial, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal spinal nerves, they form plexus. So what's a plexus? A plexus is a complex network of the nerves formed by interchanging and interlacing of fibers between different nerves. So the different nerves interchange their fibers to form a plexus. Cervical plexus supplying the cervix part of the body. In this way, the whole plexus is arranged, but they don't have specific segmental distribution, and they mostly show overlapping. So that's all for today. It was a very simple lecture about the spinal nerves formation and their anatomy. Our next lecture is going to be really important because it's going to be about the diseases of the central nervous system. It's a very important aspect to be learned about because it's very mysterious and many diseases are still unknown. So don't forget to subscribe so that you get the next video, and also click on the bell icon so that you don't miss any of our videos.